probably the most interesting news that happened this week from a vendor-driven perspective was Salesforce announcing a framework for creating open source large multimodal models. So LMMs, to be differentiated from the LLMs, large language models that we normally talk about. So they've created this open source framework for analyzing text, images, and other digital media, and that will help companies to be able to develop open source LMMs, which is interesting because right now there's a bit of a gap between open source performance and kind of the proprietary performance of LMMs. But honestly, nobody's really all that good at it yet.
Yeah, to me, there's three interesting things to this story. The first is that this is the first significant foray into the sort of acknowledgement and recognition that we are not, as humans, large language models. We do not see and understand and perceive the world through language only. There's all these other elements, which certainly we've touched on multimodal, but one of the things, OpenAI and Anthropic have gone down that road. But one of the things that this particular model does, or this approach, because it's the Salesforce researchers, it's not like this is not a go-to-market product, is something that they're calling interleaved data. And this idea that you have text and images and conceptually, I think but at least images, interspersed within the text and contextualized, and it can have multiple images. And so the premise being that, if you think about literally anything that one of us produces as a report, any magazine article, there's always images and text together, and they provide context to each other, and they're not separated. And that's what this model is attempting to do. And that alone, just from a raw technology perspective, is interesting. And something that we've talked about in the past is that, these LLMs are going to continue to evolve, and maybe they're going to evolve into LMMs. Just we need another acronym. So I think that there's that part. The second part that's fascinating to me is that while we certainly have talked about here on the show and have covered that Salesforce is certainly in the AI business with Einstein and other things, I was not aware that they were trying to get into the foundation model business and had anything going at that level, particularly because there's nothing indicating in this report anyway that any of this is really specific to like Salesforce's core business. So that was a big wow, that's really fascinating that they've decided to sort of throw their hat in the ring. And I would argue they're big enough to play with the big guys, but it does, as we've talked about, it's an expensive space to play. Is this a smart move for them, or is this just a research endeavor? And then if so, well, then why? And then the last piece of this is that was interesting is they've released it as open source, which, as we'll talk about in a moment, is this whole other area of open source versus proprietary. What is open source? Why did they do that? And how does that help with all of this? So it's really fascinating on kind of a whole bunch of different dimensions.
Yeah, I agree. And although it is hard for me to wrap my brain around this sometimes. Salesforce is now a company that has 70,000 plus employees. They are gigantic. And for those of us who have been in tech for a long time, we remember when Salesforce was this up and coming cloud-based CRM with a couple thousand employees. It was an interesting company, but it definitely was not a behemoth like it is now. And Salesforce literally has thousands of AI employees, actual data scientists who understand models, understand research, have PhDs. It's surprising to see from that angle. But when you think about text and images, I think one of the most interesting things there is that basic how-to directions on how to do anything, such as do-it-yourself carpentry or first aid, you will have text and then some sort of picture, text and some sort of picture. And right now, we don't analyze that very well because so much of our analysis of pictures is just based on metadata rather than actual contextual descriptions. So it makes sense that Salesforce would want to go there, especially for its Service Cloud, although I'm sure there are a lot of other uses. But practically, I could see this being productized in the Salesforce Service Cloud most easily as they're trying to teach customers what else to do. So it makes sense that they're going in this direction. And then the open source side, I think that's because Salesforce doesn't actually want to develop its own models. They want to give some sort of toolkit so that all of its gigantic Fortune 500 clients can have a starting point that is accessible to Salesforce at the end of the day. Rather, Salesforce doesn't need to get into the Hugging Face business or the data science platform business or all these other things that are interesting but not core to what Salesforce really cares about.
I mean, there's so first of all, I think the reason it's surprising isn't because Salesforce isn't big enough to do this. It's just that we don't typically think of them as a general purpose technology company like an Amazon or a right or a Google. But clearly they have the the heft to endeavor here, and there's a long history with companies like AT&T Bell Labs is the history, and Xerox Spark, right, where companies put out these research centers not necessarily because they're trying to monetize the technology, but because it creates a forum. Something I've preached a lot about it, right, where you're just exploring new ideas, and it gives a forum for that, and then out of that sometimes comes something that creates some form of competitive advantage or differentiation for you. So, there's nothing critical about this. I think it's fabulous, and I'm excited to maybe have somebody who doesn't have a ulterior motive to any of this sort of kind of pursue it. I mean, I'm very skeptical of. I mean, the other major open source efforts out there are Elon Musk's XAI and Meta's what is it? What I forgot they're
Yeah.
called there,
Mhm.
Llama, and I'm incredibly skeptical of both of them, right? So, the idea of Salesforce sort of weighing in and putting something into the market, I think has much greater potential for being, genuinely useful without any real strings attached to it. Um, I think the big question, and this will lead to the second part of the second story,
Mhm.
is it in fact really open source? So, shoot, I should have brought this up. The name of the group that is sort of the standard bearer for open source, the Open Source Initiative, finally sort of weighed in and created a definition. I don't think I'd even call it a standard, a definition for open source AI. And basically, I mean, the easiest way of saying it is it needs to truly be open source if you're going to call it open source AI. I mean, it basically saying that it to be qualified, it has to be used. You can use it for any purpose without permission. The researcher should be able to inspect all of its components and study that system works. It should be able to modify the system for any purpose, including changing its output and to share it with others to use with or without modifications. All this stuff, and I would argue when I read it, I don't know that any of the so-called open source AI models right now qualify. So, and I don't know if Salesforce is either. I mean, this article didn't talk about any restrictions or limitations on it. I mean, it sounds like right now it's more of a framework and an idea anyway. But it's I think it's this whole interesting question and leads into this broader, almost philosophical question as to the role of open source AI. Should this be in the public domain? I think there's at least a case to be made that it's too powerful and dangerous to be in the hands of a for-profit company, and also too potentially powerful and dangerous to just be sitting out there in the open. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure which side of this I land on.
Yeah, and I think another thing that makes open source models so difficult is simply that they're so big. It's not like you've got 1,000 lines of code that can be easily reviewed by any developer. In this case, you've got uh, gigabytes, petabytes, whatever, of data that are all being transformed into parameters that are then go through some sort of testing process, and then you get to the hyperparameterization, and then you get to the operationalization of looking at all of the outputs. So you've got all of these billions and of things that are working in conjunction in a way that isn't really very testable. So I wonder how valuable it is to truly make everything open source across the board in AI when it will take an army of people to honestly look through any LLM or LMM or LNMOMQMZM as we go through the alphabet.
I mean, the sticking point has always been the training data, And then of course the weighting and the coding and like you said, the tuning of that data during the training process, that's a little bit easier. That sort of metadata is a little bit easier to expose. It's the training data has been the big gotcha.
Mhm.
And I don't see that really changing. There's that's the challenges, frankly, most of the challenges we're seeing with all of this has to do with the training data. And then let's not forget the other issue is that it's sort of a black box. Even if you have all that, there's not really a guarantee that it's all actually going to turn out the same way. So there's all these variables around it. And to me, I look at this and say, well, to what putting let's get back to the CIO's perspective, right? How much does any of this matter? Well, I mean, I'm not sure it does insofar as I think that Salesforce doing this is like a good signaling. I was just talking to an executive about this, about the importance of signaling in the enterprise buying cycle. I think it's an important signaling of Salesforce to their customer base that says two things. That says, hey, we're big enough to play with the big boys. Look
Mhm.
at us in that way. And secondly, we're investing in trying to make the world better, and by virtue of that, your world better as being our customer. You're going to reap the benefits of what happens with it. But in pragmatic terms, as a CIO, while every enterprise has a ton of open source, they don't truly have open source in the way that it's quote unquote free, because the support issues, the management issues, all of that almost always dictates they're buying a vendor's version of it. We're going to talk about Grafana here in a minute, right? That's an
Right.
example of that. It's always how it works. And so the fact that any of these people put it out there for free, I think is relatively meaningless to the average enterprise. It's not going to be free for them. And even if it does, even if it was actually free, you have all the compute costs of training and inference that go with it. So it's never free. And so, I think it's an interesting sort of perspective, but I think you need to kind of take it with the appropriate grain, very large grain of salt.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about where you just brought up Xerox PARC. Obviously, Apple's some of their biggest innovations actually came from uh, originally Xerox PARC creating this fantastic graphical GUI interface that turned into Windows and Mac. Uh, and then we look at Polaroid, which did a fantastic job with digital cameras, but it really didn't really take off until again the iPhone made the digital camera available to everyone. So these gigantic companies with fantastic research that really did a horrible job of releasing their technology to market led to their downfalls as companies. And I think Salesforce, at least making this research and the findings available to the rest of the world uh, at this point is a smart idea. They are not locking this up for 5 years and becoming irrelevant in the AI market. So, regardless of how this ends up, it at least is a good move for the market in general that there is at least one other toolkit for looking at LMMs at this point.
Yeah, and again, they're it's not just. I mean, that's the other thing I think that they deserve some credit for. This isn't just another LLM. They're actually taking some critical thought to this and looking at it differently, which I think is useful and valuable. Um, but